Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics for the last time. So this is your final lecture. We will have a one-part lecture this time, not a two-part lecture. Karl Marx's Manifesto isn't a very large book, so I think we can handle it. And it's going to be a relatively long video, I assume, but we will do it in one video only. Okay, so just for your reference, Karl Marx's main work, his theoretical work, right, his economics, is in The Capital, right? Das Kapital. It was originally published in German, so Das Kapital. You may have heard it, someone referred to Capital like that, so that's just for your reference. And that's his lengthier book, more technical, where he goes into the theory of value that we started discussing last time. And that's where he discusses in more detail the concept of primitive accumulation, etc. Whereas his manifesto is a pamphlet, right? So it's a short essay, not really a book, it's a pamphlet. So it was a political short text. As he explained in the book, he was commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto, being one of the most important scholars at the time involved in communist scholarship. As he explains, he mainly uses the word communism instead of socialism because the word socialism was already being used by other groups that he thought that he didn't relate to, right? So the utopian socialists, I talked about that. I've mentioned how the kibbutz in Israel is inspired by utopian socialism, and also that bill, the Cincinnati Time Store bill we saw, I opened with that bill last time. So that's an example again from inspired in utopian socialism, and Karl Marx had different views, right? So he says, well, I could, if they weren't using the word socialism, I would go with manifesto, socialist manifesto, right? It's not anything in particular in the semantics or anything. It's mainly for him to make a political distinction with other groups that already use the term. All right. So the more technical parts of Marx will be in the other book that we're not discussing, and that's just a short caveat that I wanted to explain. All right, we will look at some quotes or some passages from the Communist Manifesto, and I'll give you some context. But before we jump into Communist Manifesto per se, I wanted to start actually by putting into context. So by briefly discussing the idea of private property in John Locke and Rousseau. Okay, I mean, we've talked about both of them obviously, but in order to connect Marx with Locke and Rousseau, I think it's useful to put him in context, briefly remind you, very briefly of course, remind you of the theories of these two, and put the idea of private property in a broader discussion of the role of state versus market, and yeah. So let's start by doing that. Okay, so there's a tendency in debates of making a binary distinction of markets and states, which is oversimplistic, and I want to make this idea more explicit, since we've talked about this during John Locke, but only implicitly. So the point I want to make here very briefly is, when you see these people saying, oh, markets are perfect and states are absolutely useless, or vice versa, right? Markets are completely corrupt and states are always great. Those extreme points of view, which unfortunately are I'm not going to say very common, it's but you do see these positions, okay, taking these sort of black and white 0-1 good and evil visions of markets and state, which are a little bit I'm going to say not productive because they lose the nuances of the discussions, right? And sometimes you see Republican Party and the Democrat Party associated with these visions. Not always, right? But narratives tend to acquire these somewhat exaggerated points of view, whereas we have learned from John Locke, okay, to start the discussion, that it is actually the state that guarantees property rights, isn't it? So maybe it isn't a market versus state, really, right? Maybe there are two sides of the same coin, in the sense that you cannot have the market without the state. Who is going to guarantee property rights? How can you have so you have Zuckerberg, right? And you have the Silicon Valley and people. I'm thinking about Silicon Valley and something that represents the market, right? Where you have a lot of innovation, etc. Okay, it cannot exist without the state because it needs the protection of the police. It needs laws that guarantee its ability to do businesses, etc. Right? The market is not a spontaneous institution that emerges without the protection and regulation of the state, because at the very minimum you're going to need the police, right? And property rights. If you don't have the right to acquire property and to own a piece of land and to establish your business there, right? If you don't have the state protecting that at least, then another tribe will just invade, right, your business and take it from you. Whoever is more powerful and has more guns will dominate everything, right? So it's very difficult, at least for me, to imagine capitalism and markets with anarcho-capitalism. That's what I'm thinking. Maybe anarcho-capitalism is possible, but I do not really understand it, right? Because anarcho-capitalism would assume that John Locke's argument that you need the state and the social contract in order to guarantee laws and for markets to exist, right? Because how can you have markets without property rights, without private property, right? That's the main institution of capitalism, is private property. Okay, so the question is not markets versus state, it's more or less state. States are inevitable. You cannot have markets without states because you need the police, you need property rights, etc. I'll just give you one more example. Now with Israel and Gaza, you had because I talked about this last time as well during Adam Smith, about the pirates attacking boats that were doing trade, right, basically around the area there. That was related to the war. That's why I'm mentioning the war. I don't want to start any polemic at all. But basically, arguably, anyway, related to the war, right? In connection to the war, you saw these groups of people attacking boats, etc. there. So if you don't have the U.S. Army, which is funded by the state, right, to attack the pirate ships and to sort of guarantee trade and guarantee free trade, you cannot have markets in capitalism. You see, capitalism markets imply that the United States is able to trade, right? To have ships all over the world. But if these ships are being attacked by pirates, you're going to need the state again, the military, to go and protect it. So you see, it's obviously a question of the state can be minimal and simply guarantee police force, the military, and the legislative. So you're going to need the judiciary, right, judges, etc., to obviously make decisions when there's any disputes, commercial disputes, etc. So you could have that smaller state only doing these things, or a much bigger state, right, that involves healthcare, public education, or other things. So the discussion is big versus small state. All right, it's not to have or not have. It's not state versus market, but how big should the state be, right? Where should and shouldn't the state go? And that's very clear from John Locke. onwards, all right, at least from a point of view of from intellectual point of view, from in the history of political philosophy, with John Locke, it becomes clear that markets will be dependent on the state, right? All right, so okay, so contrary to John Locke, we had Rousseau, who argued that private property was not great, actually, right? So you see here from this quote, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, and from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes and filling up ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You were undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all of us and the earth itself to nobody." So Rousseau, right? Rousseau saying, well, private property, not so great, right? Locke arguing that private property is the origin of everything, right? The civil state institutes private property alongside life and liberty, and that's where our modern democratic state begins, right? When we think about the Constitution of the United States, right, and what are the values that represent the United States, the first things you think of are the things John Locke talked about: life, liberty, and property, right? And happiness. In the Constitution, it's happiness, but that encapsulates private property as well, right? John Locke saying that, and Rousseau is saying exactly the opposite, right? I just want you to notice this. Rousseau is quite pessimistic, isn't he, about where we've ended up, and he's saying, well, where did things go wrong? If we look back in time, where did things goes wrong, and where did things go wrong? And he's going to say here, that's when the first man said, "This is mine," right? When the first person claimed private property, then we started to compare ourselves with one another, to become vain, right? After we established private property, now I want to have more land than my neighbor, in other words, right? Rousseau is saying, little by little, that's going to happen. So Marx, of course, much more similar to Rousseau and Locke. Okay, so just giving you the context and contrasting Rousseau and Locke here, so we can place Marx in the context of this debate of what makes private property legitimate. When you compare with Locke, okay, Locke, quote, "Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property," right? So, private property to Locke is a divine right, because God provided the earth for us to explore, right? So there's remember this idea of teleology. There's a telos, an end, a purpose, right? There is a goal. There's a reason why we're here in this planet. Locke is arguing. Why are we here? Why is it that we're entitled to claim private property? Well, he's arguing, if God gave us the earth, then he must have provided a way for us to explore it, right? And that's via private property, right? He's saying it wouldn't make any sense that God would put us here, right? Locke is arguing in these terms, and then that we wouldn't have the right to explore the fruits of the earth. It would be a paradox or a contradiction, right? So he's arguing from a logical / teleological and a teleological point of view, right? It's a religious point of view, but also a logical point of view. Like he's saying, well, if mankind, it seems logical to me, he's arguing, right, that if mankind should be able to claim private property and explore the earth, not to destroy everything, right? Locke clearly says that we should leave enough for the future generations, and that we shouldn't be wasting food or any of that. That we should only claim enough land that we can use, right? Like we shouldn't be claiming property if we're wasting it or not using it. And he says that in order that to make sure that everyone has access to land and to property at the end of the day. So he's not saying, oh, it's fine to claim whatever amount of land you want, right? The idea is that you are allowed to claim in so much as that allows you to survive, essentially, right? But you see, it's very, very different, of course, and much more optimistic view relative to Rousseau, that of Locke's. Contrasting these notions of Locke and Rousseau, we can use the ideas of negative liberty versus positive liberty, right? Where negative liberty is the idea of just let people be, let people do whatever they want, but without helping them do so, right? It's that the state does not prohibit anyone of doing anything. That's negative liberty, sometimes called mere liberties. Whereas positive liberty, what sometimes people call freedom, right? Remember we talked about liberty versus freedom. That's what we're talking about here again. So John Locke is to negative liberty as Rousseau and Marx are to positive liberty, right? And that corresponds more or less to the Republican versus the Democrat Party arguments. This last distinction, mere liberties versus full-blooded rights, is the distinction by David Schmitz that I want to talk about for a second. Okay, it's not your. You should not read this paper unless you want to, but he has this. David Schmitz has this paper on property, talking about this, which is very clear. And I just want to explain a little bit clearer this idea of negative. Because we've mentioned this last time, but I didn't explain it very well. So, obviously here you can see the idea of liberty versus freedom, okay, and mere liberties versus full-blooded rights. So let's look at a quote by Schmitz on this, the Institution of Property article. So he argues, if I have the liberty of doing X, then it is permissible for me to do X. But the mere fact that I am at liberty to do X leaves up the possibility that you might be at liberty to interfere with my doing X. According, liberties are not full-blooded rights, since my having a right to do X has the additional implication that others are not at liberty to interfere with my doing X. You can violate my rights, but you cannot violate liberties. Okay, so liberty, remember, or negative liberty, you cannot violate those by definition, whereas rights or positive liberty, right, freedom, those can be violated. Okay, so you have the liberty to drive anywhere, right? But that doesn't mean that you have the right to drive anywhere, because as my example from last class, okay, I have the liberty of driving everywhere, but that means that my neighbor also has the liberty of driving, right? So he can drive and stop his car in front of my of my house, right? And I can't actually drive anywhere because I can't leave. He's blocking the exit of my house, right? That's what he's saying here. You have the liberty of doing X, but then someone else can, right, prevent you from doing that because that person also has liberty, and those can contrast. So that's the notion of liberty, or negative liberty versus positive liberty and full-blooded rights and freedom, right? I think this is pretty clear here. And finally, I'm mentioning Schmitz because in his article he argues, how do we go from mere liberties to full-blooded rights? In other words, how do we go from each person having a liberty to someone having an exclusive right to the land? And if you remember, John Locke would say by mixing labor with natural resources, right? So that's what we talked about before. The labor theory of value begins in Locke because he argues when you mix your own labor with that, the providence, right, which was, that God had given to us. And then when you mix your labor with that, with nature, essentially, right, with the fruits of the earth, that's how you go from liberty to right, right? How do you acquire property rights? By mixing your labor, in other words, right? But Karl Marx has a completely different question, answer to that question. Okay, and that's what we're going to talk about for the remainder of the class. And what is interesting here is Locke, in the social contract, right? He uses not it's not a. We talked a lot about that during Rousseau, right? But all of them, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke, the three of them, they're not. It's not a historical reconstruction, but a conjectural reconstruction or a logical reconstruction, right? It's an as-if history, not the real history of the world. They're not looking at historical facts and documents or whatever, isn't it? None of them. The social contract is a mental model, okay? It's just a heuristic tool for us to understand the role of governments, the role of the state, what role it could perform, right? So when John Locke is arguing that civil society and our transition from the state of nature via the state of war and finally with the social contract guaranteeing private property, that's not the real history, right? It's a conjectural history, as it were. And Karl Marx is very different here because he's actually going to look at the actual history, the historical facts. Not a logical reconstruction, but an actual historical look at the history of it, right? Just the historical facts, nothing else. No theory, no high-end theory or speculation, but let's look at what actually happened. And what happened was basically the Enclosure Acts, right? So the Enclosure Acts in England was the process by which peasants were slowly, not so slowly, but yeah, I mean, it took a while, but peasants were slowly but surely, they migrated from the fields to the emerging cities and were sort of forced into working in factories, right? Why? Because basically, as you can see here, around 1775 in the manor of Peerage, so that's a place here. It doesn't matter where, but it's a part of England, right? You can see here. You can see here that well, I mean, it's going to be hard for you to read, but either way, just take my word here. Actually, I can make this bigger. Okay, so now you can see here arable open fields, right? So arable open fields or communal lands were parts of the fields, part of the land which were accessible to everyone. Okay, so basically, up to a point in history, what happened in England was that people had to work part of the time for the kings and the aristocracy, right? They had to work in the lands of the kings and queens and the aristocracy, etc. But they had access to these arable open fields where they could get most of the stuff they needed. For instance, they could get they had access to logs, which they could use to warm up their house, right? So I mean, basically, they could go there and cut down trees and use wood to warm up to burn wood, of course, in the fireplace during winter, etc. So they could go to the open fields and well, essentially plant whatever they wanted. So they had access to food, right? To fruits and to whatever they planted there, plus access to wood that is useful for warming up their houses during the cold winters of England. So think about this. A big chunk of the expenditure around the 18th century would be in just keeping your house warm and food, right? And when you had free access to these things, people would comfortably live in the fields. But the Enclosure Acts, right, these over 5,000 bills enacted by the parliament throughout these 300 years were acts that essentially enclosed, as you can imagine, the field, right? So basically, all of these areas which were accessible to the peasants are now no longer accessible, right? They are now private property, right? They belong to the aristocracy, right? To the kings and queens and dukes and princes and all of the earls, whatever, right? All of the aristocratic society of England. So as the land was enclosed, obviously, and the idea was, have this process which is slow, right? But where factories, the Industrial Revolution that we were talking about, is while this Industrial Revolution spreads from the north of England and from south of Scotland into the whole world, right? But around, you see here, around these 300 years, essentially you need, that's why you have the sheep here, right, as well. So you need sheep because it's a textile, in the Industrial Revolution is basically textile industry initially, right? So you need a flock of sheep for the raw material, right? The wool, etc., to produce the clothing, etc., that was being produced, the textile that was being produced in England. And so essentially, people are kicked out of their, slowly, they're kicked out of their land and they have to move to the city and start working in factories because those places which formerly were common lands, now there's sheep. There's people are raising sheep all over the common lands, and they've become private property, right? So this is a big part of the explanation of the development of capitalism. Karl Marx is saying, well, it was not this spontaneous process that all out of a sudden it just happened, right? It's actually a historical process here, and the state, this is very important. Remember where we started? The state guaranteeing private property. It's not state versus markets, but think about it. It was the state that guaranteed the Industrial Revolution, right? That doesn't mean that it had to be like this, but that's how it actually happened, in England at least. Around the world, it's different, okay? The development of capitalism in the United States, that's a different story, right? But the development of capitalism per se, the first experience, right? That's England, and that's roughly throughout this period here, right? From the 1700s onwards, but especially throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is increasing in scope and expanding territorially, as we've seen last time. But again, without the bills that were enacted by Parliament, right, people would have stayed for a much longer period in the lands rather than move to the cities to work in the factories, right? So it was the state which guaranteed the industrial army. Just to quote Marx himself, so quote, "These new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of their own means of production and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of blood and fire." So basically what I was saying, right, it's not the industrial army, okay, these new freedmen that become sellers of themselves, in other words, that become the labor force, right? It's not a spontaneous process, but there were political institutions, right? The state passing laws, passing the Enclosure Acts, which force people out, right? So just to continue, he says, "In actual history, it is notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force, played a great part. In the tender annals of political economy, the idyllic reigns of time immemorial. Right and labor were from all time the sole means of enrichment. He's criticizing Locke here, basically. Not explicitly, right? But he's saying, look, it's a bit. He's saying it's one-sided, right? That political economy in the annals of political economy. So Adam Smith, okay, David Ricardo, other people involved at the time, but also all the way back to Locke. That's where it starts, right? They only talk about labor and property, right? So this image here is supposed to express Marx's sarcastic, right, view of economics as being about how, people start working, and just contrast the visions of Rousseau, right, and Locke on property. And Marx is saying, yeah, nobody is arguing that there was conquest and enslavement, right, and that the laborers were kicked out of the land and went to the cities and forced into the cities, right? This industrial army. Nobody talks about that. Only about the rights and labor, right? Isn't it? Private property is one of the natural rights that we have, natural law and natural rights, remember? So Karl Marx is saying, if you look at the actual history of it, you'll see first the colonization of South America, Africa, and Asia, parts of Asia, right, by European countries, imperialism. You're going to see that throughout the 16th century, 17th, 18th century. That's number one, right? So conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, force, all of that. And on top of that, you see within England, the consequences of that process are the Enclosure Acts and the peasants being kicked out of, right? They had access to land which was free, which were the common lands, and they no longer have it. These common lands, they still exist in England and even in Italy. I lived in Italy, but they were just symbolic. I lived in Italy, and next to my house there was this, 5 foot by 5. I don't know. It was very small. It was tiny. It was just representative, and it was written there. This little garden here is communal, so it belongs to everyone. But it's just and in England there are a few places where it's communal land, but it's so tiny that you cannot actually plant anything there. It's as if it's similar to a public park, let's put it like that. It's just a public square or something, right? It's communal, and it's just you almost never see any of those, and they're tiny. They're just to keep the memory of what once existed. But that's exactly the point. They used to be common, and you could get their wood and food, right? So you could work just a few hours in the land of the aristocracy in order to pay your taxes, and then you still could work a few hours on your own land and you'd be fine, right? And then when you didn't have access to wood, you had to buy wood, and then you couldn't afford it any longer, and you had to move to factories. Okay, let's look at a few quotes now. And of the ones we've provided, now that we've provided this context and contrasted him meaning Marx with Rousseau and Locke, let's look at a few quotes of the Communist Manifesto per se and discuss a little bit. So, quote, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise the spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies." So he starts, it's funny because he calls communism a ghost, right? It's haunting Europe, right? And you could think, well, that's not a great strategy, right? Maybe he should say, no, communism is great, it's not evil, etc. But what he tries to do, that's just his strategy. Whether it was a good or bad idea, you can think about it, you can decide that yourself. But he begins the Communist Manifesto with this powerful quote where he's saying, well, people, basically Marx is saying, people have been saying that been talking about the ghost of communism, that we're gonna come and conquer everything. Guess what? That's right. That's what we are. Okay, he's just trying to claim it and say, yeah, we are a powerful, okay, ghost, and we're haunting it. That's right. Um, we're going to, workers of the world unite, the very sentence that closes the manifesto, right? He's basically starting by claiming, yes, we're going to conquer everything and communism is going to spread to the whole world. And if you think we are scary and powerful, that's right, that's what we are. We are a ghost, right? If you want to frame us like that, I'm going to claim it. So that is opening argument at the manifesto. And he starts by saying, it's interesting that if you look historically, society was always more complex than it is now. Basically, it's going to argue that now there's only two classes, right? The bourgeoisie versus, right, the worker versus the boss, isn't it? There's the two classes, the employer and the employee. That's Marx's vision. The class conflict between the haves and the have-nots, right? And he's going to argue, well, actually, before capitalism, society had more than two classes. In Rome, for example, you see the patricians, the knights, the plebeians, and the slaves, right? And so four classes. In the Middle Ages, you see a bunch of different classes: the lords, the vassals, the guild masters, the serfs, journeymen, apprentices, bunch of different classes, right? In Plato's Republic, there are three classes, not two classes, right? Adam Smith as well uses three classes, right? The landowner, to Adam Smith, there's rent, profit, and wage, because you have the landowner, the capitalist, and the worker, right? So still three classes. And Adam Smith's going, or Marx is going to argue, no, nowadays it's simplified, right? Society used to be more complex, had more layers, more than two classes, as you see, and now we won't have two classes, right? So, quote, our epoch possesses this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? So now we have only two classes. Marx is arguing that basically the owners of the factories, that is the capitalists, right, or the bourgeoisie, versus the workers, that is the proletariat, right, the haves and the have-nots. So part of what's happening is that he's seeing this new industrial class sort of taking over the former, right, the former aristocracy, right, all of those old classes that existed, lords, guild masters, right, the landowners that didn't work, they just owned land, right, and could explore the peasants, etc. All of these slowly but surely are taken over by capitalists because they're making more money, right? Obviously, I mean, people who have factories in England are making a lot more money relative to the aristocrats, which were just, renting their lands, but they didn't have profit, the profit motive in their minds, right? Because capitalism didn't exist, so people basically weren't thinking about, how do I innovate, how do I make my business, my lands more efficient, etc., right? They were basically during the Middle Ages, for a very long period, the level of GDP or wealth didn't increase much for 1,000 years, right? Societies become, it's not like nothing happened. Some stuff happened, of course, or many things happened, obviously. So it's not 1,000 years nothing happened, but relative to what happened in the last 500 years, right? Let's think about this since Leonardo da Vinci, since the Italian Renaissance or so, right? Since then, obviously, technology and art and science has been progressing much faster, right? So you have that very long period where you had the again, the lords and vassals and guild masters and serfs, journeymen and apprentices, where the world hasn't changed very quickly, right? People were stuck in those pre-capitalistic mindsets of the Middle Ages, right? That's pre-capitalism, of course. And then, with the beginning of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx is seeing essentially this new class, the bourgeoisie, right? They're going to take over everything. And indeed, that did happen more or less, right? I mean, in England, you still have the king, right? Nowadays, it's a king now. But it's more or less symbolic, right? They don't really have political power as they used to, right? They have some power, of course. They definitely have a lot of money, but they don't own England the way it used to be, right? It's a bit symbolic. When you look at the other countries in England, in Europe, right? France, etc., etc., it's true that these several classes no longer exist, right? Nowadays you have whether or not it's just two classes is a different issue. All I'm saying is that all of these old classes that existed, the lords and guild masters, etc., they were replaced by, right, the modern businesses, corporations, industries, etc., etc. Okay. Marx argues also that, quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So that is actually quite relevant and interesting, I'd say, for current debates, because when you see Marx criticizing the state here, I think that helps, again, where we started from today's class. State versus market, oversimplistic, right? And the conversation should be much more nuanced than that. It's not that Marx or communists always defend the state and vice versa, right? We should just put everything into the appropriate context, I feel like. So Marx here basically is making an argument, when you think about it, which is very, very similar to this contemporary idea of crony capitalism, right? Essentially, he's arguing, look, the state is privileging interest groups, and there's a lot of lobbying, which basically controls the government and the state. Therefore, the state fails in whatever, like the state intervention. Some people argue that state intervention is doomed to fail, right? Because the government is in the pockets of certain groups that have money and power and influence anyway, right? So they will do. Remember Thrasymachus' argument in the Republic, right? That kind of argument is associated and similar to crony capitalism. Some interest groups dominate anyway. Public policies are designed to favor certain interest groups. And Marx is making a similar argument, believe it or not, right? So Marx's idea was that capitalism would self-destroy itself because some companies would become monopolies, and well, it's a complicated and long story that I'm not going to go into the details, otherwise this class will be too long. But essentially, and we'll see a quote now that shows in a second that shows this, but Marx essentially seeing this self-destructive tendency of capitalism. He thought that communism would be the inevitable stage that would follow after capitalism, and capitalism would destroy itself precisely because there's a tendency for some companies to dominate the whole market, Marx is arguing, right? So there's a tendency to go from competition, from a competitive market, to a market dominated by monopolies, and that's bad for the economy itself. So you see, it's there. He sees almost a tribal war tendency that exists, that is inherent to capitalism, because he thinks if companies are greedy like that and trying to increase their profits, they will, compete with each other, etc., etc., and eventually there's going to be one company that will dominate everything, and therefore there won't be, many jobs being created. There's not going to be innovation, etc., etc., and finally, there's going to be one point where there's going to be just one last capitalist in the whole world, right? If you follow this tendency, sort of evolutionary war, where the competition would lead to one person owning the whole economy and the whole society, the 8 billion people in the world working for this for this own last person in the world, right? I'm just making a model here so you understand more or less where this is going. So essentially, it would be so easy, right? It's basically saying at that point where you have just one person who owns everything and everyone's working for that person, it would be very easy for people to overthrow this last capitalist, and then the working class would own everything, and that's when communism. You see, so basically, right? If companies keep, now you have Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and George Soros, right, the billionaires, and Marx is saying he's wrong about this, right? But that was his vision, right? That they would annihilate one another. Maybe this could take hundreds of years, but eventually there would be just one last capitalist who owned everything, and then 7 billion people would be very easy for them to just go there and kill that person, essentially, right? And then everyone would own everything. So that's a bit like, I'm butchering a bit the idea, but otherwise we'll have a 2-hour class and you do not want that. But either way, this is the idea here of the state being, right, completely dominated by the bourgeoisie, right? Which is, you see, that would lead to eventually one lobbyist dominating everything, etc., etc. Okay. Next quote I wanted to briefly talk about is, quote, in place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. So he's talking here about globalization and capitalism, and he sees this as a problem, universal interdependence of nations, and I typically think he's wrong about this. I don't know, so it's not right or wrong, but what I want to say is that, interesting enough, I think, so there's a COVID here, right? Why am I bringing this up? Because I think Marx is typically wrong when he's making this point, but he was right during COVID. That's the only point I'm going to make here, right? Because he's saying, look, we used to have self-sufficiency, right? And now we have interdependence, universal interdependence of nations. But in general, it's good that we are interdependent, right? Trade in general is good, right? It increases our wealth, etc. in general. So he sees that as problematic, this interdependence. But I don't think he's right in general. In general, it's good that we are trading and that we are dependent. In other words, it only becomes a problem in extreme scenarios, right? In other words, when we are forced to no longer trade, then you realize that yes, there's a negative side to globalization and capitalism in moments like that. So just to provide another extreme example, if you have a war, right? We have a bunch of wars going on right now. So probably when you have wars, it might happen that your country is isolated, right? That trade is disrupted, etc. And then if your country only produces one kind of commodity and you import everything else, right? When you have a war or when there's COVID or an epidemic, something like that, it might be tough indeed, right? You might pay the price in those moments. But in general, I think this point doesn't hold in general. Okay, this idea that self-sufficiency or seclusion would be better to globalization, essentially, I don't think that's accurate, but in some circumstances he's right, at least, right? That's why I want to point out that COVID here or wars potentially leading to this cut of the interruption of trade, etc. Okay, so last time we also looked at the contour lines, how the Industrial Revolution spread to most of Europe. Here you see Marx reflecting on that, on the expansion of capital. So, quote, the bourgeoisie draws even the most barbarian nations into civilization. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. So, again, here, capitalism is not a choice, he's arguing, right? So, as you saw the contour lines last time, but basically, as the Industrial Revolution spreads to Europe and throughout the world, well, most parts of the world, it compels all nations on pain of extinction, he's arguing. So, this is Marx reading of the development of capitalism. So it begins with the primitive accumulation, right? So the primitive accumulation is those hundreds of years where Europe is accumulating capital, right, by exploring colonized nations, South America, Africa, India, right, parts of Asia, etc. And then as it expands, it drags every country in the world, right, into capitalism. So it creates a world after its own image. Marx goes on, the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. He does make just one compliment to capitalism, if you will, is that the only good thing about all of this, he's saying, is that rural life was so dumb, he's saying, right? The idiocy of rural life. You see people here, I mean, these pictures, I've generated them to show how bored people were. I mean, I'm just trying to render Marx's quote, right? Realistic, I mean, with an image. I'm just trying to render it, illustrate it. But you see people bored here, etc., right? So he's here. Why am I pointing this out? Because of Rousseau, right? If Rousseau saw the real life and this sort of like stoic, slow, non-greedy life as the ideal, right? The only way to rescue civilization from its own dumbness. Marx is here, he's very similar to Rousseau, but not exactly, right? Remember I mentioned why he opposed to the label of socialist, and he used the idea of communism instead of socialism, because it's precisely utopian socialism, which looks more like Rousseau, and this idea of a rural life, a community that lives isolated. I mentioned the kibbutz. Kibbutz is more or less like this, right? But examples that are more similar to utopian socialism, we don't find them very often, but they happen in the United States. If you just Google utopian socialism, you'll see the examples, but we've had these communities, right? Isolated communities that try to, maybe the best example of utopian socialism nowadays, more or less looks like this would be Amish and Mennonite communities in the United States, where they live isolated, they're self-sufficient, they share everything, they're not trying to, right, make profits and expand, like buy more land. That's, you know, I mean, they're living sort of a simple life, isn't it? So those societies there are a little bit similar to what Rousseau had in mind and to the utopian socialists. So just to make that very clear, while Rousseau and Marx are more or less similar, at least when you compare both of them to Locke, right? They are towards the left side of the political spectrum relative to Locke, who is in the right of the political spectrum. But on the other hand, there's still a big distinction here between Marx and Rousseau, right? Rousseau would be deeply offended with the idiocy of the rural life, where Marx is saying the only thing good about it is at least the cities, they may be unfair, right, and have a lot of inequality and be horrible for many reasons, but at least they're not as stupid as the rural life. It's okay. This is not supposed to, this is just Marx's view. This is not me saying that rural life is bad or good or anything. I just want you to understand the distinction, okay? That's the only good thing he says about it. And then, as I mentioned before, the self-destruction tendency. So, quote, a similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois societies, like the sorceress, who is no longer able to control the powers of the nether world, whom he has called upon, up by his spell. So, very pretty quote here. I like it a lot. And remember what I've mentioned before: capitalism self-destroys itself. If companies, right, if we move from a competitive economy where you have hundreds of companies to oligopolies to monopolies and to eventually one company that owns everything, you have just one person that owns Coca-Cola, computers, production of telephones, everything, right? If the person who is making more profit can slowly think about the Rockefeller was at one point owned so many companies, they had so much economic power, right? What if that family continued buying everything until eventually they owned the whole world, essentially, right? Then it would be very easy to overthrow them, right? If you had just one family owning everything. So more or less, that's what he's saying here. Capitalism is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, right? He's using poetry here to basically argue that which I explained, and which you would be able to better understand if you looked at the Capital. But then it's going to be hundreds of pages, and unfortunately we don't have the time to read the Capital, and that's why we're reading the Communist Manifesto, which is a shorter version, and at least you can have an introduction to the ideas, of course. All right, moving on. The Industrial Army, you see the picture here. So the Industrial Army was the army of laborers that was created with the Enclosure Acts, right? That we were talking about, as peasants were forced out of the fields because of the Enclosure Act. So, quoting here Marx, quote, masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As an industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class, but of the bourgeois state. They are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine. So, again, we've talked a bit about this. We've seen the sheep there, that image I've showed you before, the Enclosure Act, and people used to be able to get by, right, because they had access to common lands and to wood, etc. And they now, so Marx sees this industrial army, in other words, as a or part of the development of capitalism, right? As, I mean, you need cheap labor in order for factories to be profitable. And in order to have cheap labor, you need a big supply of labor, right? Obviously. Initially, you didn't have it. People were living on the fields because they had access to common land. So there weren't many people. You didn't have big cities or anything like that. You didn't have factories, big cities, nothing, right? But that process of the Industrial Revolution with factories, right? Factories will be the more profitable, the cheaper labor is, right? So as laborers are made available by kicking out peasants from the open lands, right, from the common lands to the cities, you create this industrial army. That's what Marx is arguing here, basically. It's the historical process that led to the development of capitalism, right? Okay, the final point I want to make here is that he also, one of the things that I'll give him credit also for that he got right, although there's probably most of it didn't materialize, you could say, right? I mean, he predicted the end of capitalism. That never happened, right? Well, actually, what we saw was the emergence of communism, and that lasted a few decades, but now we see it mostly, right? I mean, then what we saw was the other way around. We saw capitalism winning over communism, wasn't it? We saw the end of the Soviet Union, and of course, there's still some countries in the world trying to revamp communism, but relative to 50 years ago, when you had the Cold War, it was unclear whether capitalism or communism would win at some point in the 60s, 70s, right? And now we can say that communism is winning. Maybe it hasn't won, but it's doing a lot better than it was 50 years ago, wasn't it? We don't have the Soviet Union. You have China, but that's not communism like the Soviet Union was, right? It's a different project, a more hybrid project of state capitalism, which is, anyway, let's not get into that very much, into the details. But either way, just want to close with this last quote here. So to mention one of the points that he did get right, one of the things that were confirmed by history. So he argues here, the proletariat direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy important wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force and vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. So you see this image here. This actually happened, okay, during the 19th century. There were several episodes of the working class destroying the machines, right? And it's interesting that what Marx is pointing out here is it's weird, right? They were not trying. In other words, they're not trying to. They're trying to destroy the machines, the instruments of production itself, because they're thinking that it's the machine that is enslaving them rather than people, right? Rather than the bourgeois class. Marx is saying, no, it's not the machines. Actually, it would be better for you to not destroy any of the machines, but to take over control over them, right? The proletariat, on Marx's vision of society, would own all means of production. You still want the machines. What you want to destroy, though, is the employer, not the machines, right? Marx is saying, and he thought that would happen anyway as capitalism developed naturally into communism. So he's saying, guys, this is silly, right? We're just, because if we destroyed the bourgeois class instead of the machines, then we could collectively own the machines and, right, share the products, all of us. That's what communism should be like. We shouldn't be looking at the rural life as Rousseau argues or anything like that, but we want to still have an industrial society, and we want to still have innovation and produce goods, etc. In factories, the only thing we want to do is that we want to have a fair society where we share everything, right? Rather than having some people with disproportional part of the income. Whether or not that's possible is a different issue, but I just wanted you to, just wanted to close with this image here of the working class. If you've probably studied this throughout high school, I think possibly, right? These episodes when in the 19th century, where in the early history of the working class, when they start try and smash factories as a protest against their conditions, but obviously that didn't prove anything, and later they would try other avenues, right? But okay, so that's the last thing I wanted to mention, and just wanted to conclude this lecture and the course, therefore, by thanking you for your time. I hope this was interesting and productive, and that you've learned a great deal about politics and ethics, and it was a pleasure to teach you, although we're not seeing each other, but it was a pleasure to teach you, and I certainly try my best, and I hope this was useful for you. So I just want to say that I'm looking forward to reading your essays, and that's about it. So thank you, guys, and I'll read your essays, and make sure you email me if you have any questions about the essay or any last questions about Plato. I'm happy to answer to your questions. Thank you very much, and that's about it. Bye.